The US action was directed at specific sites central to Iran's nuclear program.
U.S. President Donald Trump says Israel and Iran have agreed to a complete and total ceasefire.
The world has long agreed Iran cannot be allowed to get a nuclear weapon.
Israel and the United States have sought to characterise these attacks as preemptive strikes or acts of self-defence.
And the claims are utterly preposterous.
Professor Ben Saul, thanks for speaking to Full Story.
Good to be with you.
We are seeing a rapidly evolving and worsening situation in the Middle East. As we record, the world is waiting to see how and when Iran will respond to US strikes over the weekend. What was your reaction when you heard that the US had struck Iranian nuclear facilities?
It's an extraordinary development which follows, of course, on Israel's own extraordinary attack on Iran preceding this. Under international law, it's clearly a legal strike. Under the United Nations Charter, it's prohibited to use military force against any other country unless it's in self-defense against an actual armed attack that is already occurring or it is about to imminently occur. And of course, here, Iran has no nuclear weapons and no concrete, specific intention to use them against either the United States or Israel. So this is an extraordinarily dangerous development for the international rule of law, which so many countries speak about and say they care about. But here, this is an example of really preventive unilateral disarmament of another country in flagrant breach of international law.
I want to break down some of what you've just said. Israel and the United States have sought to characterise these attacks as preemptive strikes or acts of self-defence. You, amongst other legal experts, have labelled them as unlawful. I was hoping you could explain what self-defence is under international law and when force is allowed.
The United Nations Charter in Article 2.4 prohibits the unilateral use of force with only two exceptions. So one is if the Security Council authorises a country or a group of countries to use force, and that obviously hasn't happened here, or a country is victim of what we call an armed attack. An armed attack is a particularly serious use of force. So not every small incident like the firing of a few bullets or a few mortars across a border, that kind of small incident will not be treated as an armed attack, and therefore it won't give you give rise to a right of self-defense. But anything larger than that becomes what we call an armed attack, and certainly sending B-2 bombers and firing Tomahawk cruise missiles from a submarine would constitute an armed attack. The thing about the UN Charter is an armed attack has to be an actual attack. So that's something which is currently happening and ongoing, or it is something which is imminent. So a threat is about to manifest. So let's say, for example, you've received intelligence that a military is going to launch an attack on your country at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. You don't have to wait until that attack crosses your border to respond in self-defense. But beyond that, the international community has never accepted any claim for a wider doctrine of preventive or anticipatory self-defense. That's because that kind of a doctrine like that would be so liable to abuse in practice that it just makes it too dangerous for the world to accept that kind of doctrine. You know, we live in a world where lots of countries have hostile relations with other countries. They'd like to see, foreign militaries degraded or depleted so that one day they couldn't attack you. But when the United Nations Charter was written in 1945, the countries that emerged from that Second World War decided that the use of military force should be reserved for only those most serious cases where an attack is actually happening or about to happen, and everything else should be dealt with through peaceful means like diplomacy, the Security Council, sanctions, taking cases to international courts and tribunals, because otherwise you start killing too soon. It starts escalating disputes between countries. And that's not good for peaceful settlement of international disputes.
Now, the Australian government has explicitly stated that it supports President Donald Trump's strikes on Fordow, Natanz and Esfahan.
The world has long agreed Iran cannot be allowed to get a nuclear weapon. And we support action to prevent that, and that is what this is.
It also didn't condemn Israel's initial attacks on Iran, which killed nuclear scientists and members of Iran's military. Have you been surprised by the position taken by the Australian government, and how does it compare to the stance of other countries?
It seems to be a similar position to a small group of Western countries that have supported this action and before it, the Israeli action. So that includes the UK, France, Germany, the United States, Australia. That's really out of step with international opinion because the vast majority of countries worldwide have not supported this strike or these strikes in any way. And if you look at the last 70 plus years since 1945, when the United Nations Charter was written, claims of preventive self-defense have always been rejected. I mean, you really can't point to a single serious case where world opinion has supported those kinds of claims to preventively disarm or preventively degrade another country's military. In 1981, Israel bombed an Iraqi nuclear reactor on the pretext of preventing Iraq acquiring nuclear weapons. I mean, this was a civilian reactor under construction. I mean, it was years and years away from any possibility of diversion to a nuclear weapons program. It was condemned by the United Nations Security Council, including the United States. In 2007, Israel bombed a Syrian nuclear reactor. Again, no support from states. Remember, after the terrorist attacks of 11 September 2001, the then US President, George Bush, announced the so-called Bush Doctrine, this new national security doctrine where he claimed the United States would undertake preventive action against weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. That was denounced by the international community, including the United Nations. And just a few years later, US President Obama rescinded that strategy because it was seen as so out of step with the international community. So this is a really alarming development that a number of Western liberal democracies would suddenly support a fundamental change to the international rules on the use of force that have tried to keep us all safe for over 7 decades.
You say it's a fundamental change. I wonder, what is your view then on the question of whether intelligence gathered at the Pine Gap joint US-Australian military base in Central Australia, whether that was used in this attack? The Foreign Minister Penny Wong would not comment when asked whether such intelligence was used.
We don't comment on intelligence matters. We certainly don't comment on the sorts of matters you're asking me about. What I would say, though, is the US has made clear publicly these were unilateral strikes.
Is that something that Australians have a right to know about?
It certainly highlights the lack of transparency around decision-making about the use of force globally and here in Australia as well. I mean, one of the problems with both the US and the Israeli strikes is that they're making these extraordinary claims about how close Iran is to developing a nuclear weapon, but not disclosing the basis of any of that intelligence. Now, of course, everybody understands that governments need to protect the sources and methods of intelligence collection, but that doesn't mean you can't disclose anything to the world about these extravagant claims that you appear to be making. I mean, just months ago, the US national intelligence community publicly assessed that Iran is not pursuing a nuclear weapon. And suddenly, just a few months later, we're being told that there's some kind of imminent nuclear attack on Israel. I mean, the claims are utterly preposterous. It's also preposterous because if you think about it, Israel is the only nuclear-armed state in the Middle East. When it comes to Pine Gap, look, certainly this is an example where Australia's alliance with the United States certainly raises the security threat level to Australia and Australians. We've been becoming closer and closer to the United States in recent years. More hosting of U.S. forces, the joint AUKUS program, the long-running Pine Gap relationship. And I think when you are faced with an ally as unreliable and law-breaking as the US under President Trump, I think Australia should ask really hard questions about the value of that security alliance and whether it's making life more dangerous for Australia than more secure.
Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu have both used the phrase peace through strength. It's something that many Western military analysts often advocate for in the press. It's something that the former Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison repeated yesterday. I wonder if I can get your reflections on that approach.
So it's one thing to have and maintain a strong military in peacetime as a deterrent to other countries using force against you. Everybody accepts that. That's completely consistent with international law and the rules on the use of force. On the other hand, if the suggestion is that anytime someone presents an emerging threat to your country, you can bomb them into submission. That's just a recipe for the law of the jungle. This takes us back to a pre-1945 era where there weren't strong constraints on the use of force. There weren't strong multilateral institutions for dealing with the settlement of disputes, through the Security Council, the General Assembly, the International Court of Justice. And where that inevitably leads you, actually, is to everybody feeling more insecure. So I think this is a really dangerous moment for eroding and destabilizing the international rules on the use of force, which aim to keep the world safe and to undermine the multilateral order, which is really being sidelined and marginalized by this fallback on great power politics. And if you think about it, from Australia's standpoint, we're building this AUKUS program with the United States and the UK. Well, if we go down this path, we're inviting other countries to preventively bomb our nuclear submarine bases because one day they might be used against another country in a way that they don't like.
You've alluded to the uncanny similarities between what we're witnessing happening now and the US-led invasion of Iraq 20 years ago. The US president has this morning seemed to threaten regime change in Iran, something that Israel has long wanted. You've been critical of the Australian government's weak stance so far. What would you like to see Australia do and say, or more broadly, what would you like the international community to do?
Well, back in 2003, of course, the Labor Party, then in opposition, opposed the government's decision to go to war in Iraq for the principled reason that the Labor Party said it would be in violation of international law. Iraq hadn't attacked anybody. There was no Security Council resolution authorizing an intervention in Iraq. And the then Howard government, of course, invaded Iraq anyway, which is an armed attack on Iraq under the United Nations Charter. It's a violation of the most fundamental rule of international order. So I think it's quite extraordinary that the Labor Party in government now would completely reverse its position from 2003. What I found shocking this time round, actually, is just how little international legal argument and debate has featured in the public discussion and the political discussion of this attack on Iran. Saddam Hussein was a pariah state as well. like Iran is considered by some Western governments. But it feels like international law has been so heavily eroded in recent years, maybe by what Russia's done in Ukraine, even though we call them out for aggression, even though we're committing it, the US is committing it now in Iran. But events in the Middle East with really systematic violations of international humanitarian law by Israel, funded and armed by the United States, and haven't met any kind of really serious international response to hold perpetrators accountable for war crimes. And quite to the contrary, we've seen attacks on those institutions like the International Criminal Court and the United Nations, who have been trying to hold states accountable for the rules that they agreed they should follow as members of the international community. So for that reason, I think this is a very dangerous moment for international law and the so-called rules-based international order that countries like Australia say they care about, until they don't. Until they think it's fine because the United States and Israel have decided they want to bomb Iran. We're just going to be carried along with that without any real reflection on the lawfulness of doing that and the long-term consequences of doing that for the international order. How can we protest what Russia is doing in Ukraine? How can we protest what China is doing in the South China Sea if we're doing, our version of the same thing?
Professor Saul, as you say, this is all happening while Israel continues its strikes on Gaza, while people continue to be killed, seeking to access food and aid. Has Benjamin Netanyahu, do you think, orchestrated a deflection here that has shifted the world's eyes and attention away from what many have concluded is a genocide in Gaza?
It's hard for me to speculate about what's going on in the mind of Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, certainly he has wanted to deal with, attack, overthrow the Iranian government for many decades. So it could be simply that he feels this is an opportunistic moment because Iran's allies, Hezbollah, etc., have been so heavily weakened by Israeli military action in the last 18 months. And so this is, the best possible military moment to do it. And of course, there were, preceding the recent attacks over the last 18 months or so, there have been a series of Israeli strikes on Iran, which have weakened the Iranian military as well as its proxies. Certainly, we can say that nobody's talking about Gaza this week or last week, and probably for some weeks to come. So, if that were the aim, it's been a very successful effort to shunt Gaza off the international agenda. Greenlighting attacks on Iran is the worst possible thing because it just emboldens Israel further to think it's above the law. There are no consequences. There's utter impunity for anything Israel does in the Middle East.
As we've been discussing, we are now in a situation where two nuclear-armed states have essentially gone to war using the unsubstantiated claim that a third state, Iran, is on the brink of acquiring its own nuclear arms. You've written for The Guardian that Israel's lawless attacks hand Iran the legal right to self-defense. So what happens now? Can you see room for negotiation?
You're right. Iran has the right of self-defense, and maybe it will choose to exercise that in some way by continuing to attack Israel and escalating attacks on the United States in some way. The difficulty prudentially for Iran is that, faced with those two very powerful militaries against it, it doesn't have a lot of options. And, whereas Kuwait in 1990 called on the world to exercise collective self-defense on its behalf against Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, Iran doesn't have many friends, and it's very unlikely that many countries would ride to its rescue and start a war with Israel or the United States in order to help Iran. So it really depends how militarily weakened Iran feels like this, whether it feels like it has options to sustain some kind of military campaign against one or other of those countries. Even if the Iranian regime, was not popular amongst Iranians, often what happens when wars like this start is that you get a surge of nationalism by individual citizens who don't particularly care about the government, but they care about their country. And if they're being attacked by foreign powers like Israel and the United States, that can lead to political drivers for governments to react militarily in their own way and strengthen support for those kinds of military responses. So there's a lot that I think is unpredictable in the days and weeks ahead.
Just finally, we've discussed the erosion of global norms and the rules-based order. What are the consequences of that? What are the long-term human costs of that?
You can already see the immediate human costs, which are ordinary civilians die and get injured. You see that on the streets of Israel and Iran at the moment, and that's the kind of bloodshed you're likely to see magnified in future conflicts if we continue to go down this path of preventive military force. And the thing about military force is so often it's just incredibly unpredictable where it will lead once you unleash it. I think that's the one of the key lessons of the last couple of decades of Western interventions in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya. You think you might go in with this clinical bombing campaign to kind of surgically get a result you want. It almost never works out like that. It usually descends into decades and decades of instability. This is absolutely the pathway we're increasingly heading down if we accept and legitimize and have governments like Australia supporting this kind of extremely dangerous preventive logic.
Professor Ben Saul, thanks so much for your time and for breaking down the legal aspects of this for us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.